The Idyllic 50s to the Turbulent 60s, Robin Talbot, History 328, a companion to our Consensus and Dissent Perceptive. The 1950s and 60s were a time filled with change for women in America. At the start of the era, women went from work outside the home, filling the jobs men left behind, to a return to the home and focus on family. There was no more rationing. Husbands and children became a woman's main priority. Women also became the head consumer for the family. Moving to the suburbs meant new homes, new babies, and new appliances. The goal for women post-World War II had been a return to normalcy, and American women achieved it. They just didn't realize that once the goal was reached, they might just want a little more out of life. The 1960s started with a great leap forward for women with the release of the first birth control pill. While it was far from perfect at its release, the availability of the pill allowed women to entertain the notion of sexual equality with men. Two other factors contributed to the changing idea of what a woman wanted out of her life. The first was the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, and the other was a publication of a book by author Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. Women had become unfulfilled by their role as wife and mother, but had difficulty articulating it, even to each other. Friedan gave these women a voice. When we talk about the changes of the 50s and 60s that led to the women's liberation movement, we tend to hear the stories of white, middle to upper class, educated women in the North. In the United States of the 1950s, class held less importance than at other times in the nation's history, but region and race was defining. In the South, black women were embroiled in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Ann Robinson, and Daisy Bates were organizing boycotts, sit-ins, and marches in the name of equal rights. These women's experiences in the civil rights movements mirrors the experience of white women in the suburbs in a key way. They were marginalized. Black women, though the backbone of the civil rights movement, were given menial or secretarial jobs. The inability to step up and take a leadership role if you were a woman transcended race lines. By the 1960s, many college-age whites were involved in the civil rights movement with groups such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, as well as the anti-war movement protesting America's involvement in Vietnam. Women of all races learned through their experiences with these groups just how unequal things between the sexes really were. 37% of claims received by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in its first year centered around sex discrimination. The National Organization for Women was created, and in its mission statement vowed to bring women's rights and human rights together. The High School Women's Liberation Coalition published a list of questions titled, "What Every Young Girl Should Ask," in an effort to involve teenagers in the growing movement. Questions such as, "Are girls with boyfriends winners? What did they win?" And "Is your mother an oppressed woman?" served to illustrate the cultural shift that the women's movement was bringing about. Women's contributions during this time period were varied, but all were important. Post-World War II, consumerism ruled, and the women of America were its queen. They were responsible for moving money through America's booming post-war economy by controlling the major purchasing decisions of the home. While they may not have been able to step outside the home and provide income to their household, they certainly took control when it came time to spend it. Women drove the birth of the civil rights movement. The movement could not have survived without their hard work and determination. Through efforts that ranged from grassroots to nationwide, women were the organizing force behind marches, boycotts, and sit-ins. While men such as Martin Luther King Jr. earned national prominence as the public leaders of the movement, it could not have succeeded without women such as Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer. A legacy of the women of the 50s and 60s that cannot be overlooked is the creation of the next generation of activists. Women of this era learned a great deal from writers such as Betty Friedan and Helen Gurley Brown. These writers and others brought the issues facing women into the spotlight. Suddenly, women realized that they weren't the only ones feeling dissatisfied and underappreciated. It became clear to them that there was more to life than husband, home, and children, and they began to encourage their daughters to find it. The idyllic Leave It to Beaver lifestyle of the 1950s quickly gave way to the turbulent 60s. The era was one of great social change through movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Anti-War Movement, and finally the Women's Liberation Movement. Women's goals shifted from being the perfect wife and mother who devoted her life to her family to earning the right to be an independent and equal member of society.